On behalf of Mormon Women for Ethical Government, welcome to our event, Voting in Arizona, Faith, Business, and Legal Perspectives. I'm Andrea Messenger-Dalton, IMWEG Arizona's chapter lead. The IMWEG Arizona chapter is co-hosting this event with Stand Up Republic Arizona and Leadership Now, and we're so glad that you chose to participate in this event today. Whether you've joined in the Zoom call or watching on Facebook Live, or are viewing the recording of this event at a later time. We have a really fantastic lineup of speakers today who will offer different perspectives on understanding the current contours of voting in Arizona and how this impacts the nation. We are so grateful to each of them for taking the time to participate in this event and share their perspectives with us. Each speaker will briefly introduce themselves, and we will drop their bios in the chat so you can learn more about them. Then we will have a brief Q&A session after the speakers. If you have questions or are on the Zoom, you can enter your questions into the Q&A box that appears when you select that option at the bottom bar of the Zoom. If you're watching on Facebook, we have a member of our team who will be monitoring there for questions. I will begin the presentation with how faith informs my views of voting access, but I want to first share a little about Mormon Women for Ethical Government in case you're unfamiliar. We are a proactive, faithful, and nonpartisan organization of women who are dedicated to living peaceful, proactive, faithful, and nonpartisan as an organization, and are passionate about ethical government from all across the nation and political spectrum. As I have worked with IMWEG and have considered my faith values, I have determined that protecting the voice of my neighbors is not only my Christian duty, but is essential for our continuing democracy. In the spring of last year, a broad coalition of Christian leaders, including the National Council of Churches and National Association of Evangelicals, wrote a letter to every member of Congress and each US Senator. And this letter read in part, "We believe that each person and therefore each voter is made in the image of God, and that any effort to discourage or suppress their vote assaults their human dignity and undermines our democracy." For many of us, voting isn't too difficult, even with voting restrictions in place. We have jobs with flexible schedules, cars that have associated government-issued IDs, babysitters, a polling place in our neighborhood, a permanent home address. When we take these for granted, it's hard to see a problem with voting restrictions. But some of us are impacted by these circumstances. And Christianity demands that we view those effects as seriously as if our own voting access or our own rights were being restricted. Voting equality is an ideal that patriotic people have been fighting for throughout our country's history. Abraham Lincoln in 1854 said, "Allow all the governed an equal voice in the government, and that only is self-government." Patriots throughout history have remained committed to the vision that our democracy works best when all eligible voters, regardless of race, gender, political affiliation, and state or neighborhood, can participate and have their voices heard. In the Book of Mormon, a book of scripture used by members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a prophet teaches that a majority of people usually want to do what is right, and that governing according to the will of the majority will have the best outcomes. The text says, "Therefore, this shall ye observe and make it your law, to do your business by the voice of the people." An ethical government, which in the words of the Declaration of Independence, derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, must respond to the voices of all citizens. We need to ensure that as a nation, our business is being done by the voice of all the people. And as a person of faith, I consider it a blessing to use my voice to ensure the voices of others are heard. Thank you. Now we'll be hearing from Stephen Richer, who is the Maricopa County Recorder.
Do I just take it away? All right, fantastic. Well, my name is Stephen Richer. I am, as mentioned, the Maricopa County Recorder. But before I get into that, I would be remiss if I didn't thank, of course, Emway, Leadership Now, and also the Stand Up Republic Arizona chapter and anyone else involved in this. But thank you to the three of those organizations for putting this event on. Maricopa County Recorder's Office. The Recorder's Office is tasked with three primary responsibilities, and that's the recording of public documents, which is a side that fortunately very few people talk about, the voter registration database of 2.6 million registered voters in Maricopa County. We are the second largest voting jurisdiction in the United States, and the administration of elections. So I ran for this office and I was elected this past November as a Republican. And my platform had been to make the recorder's office boring again, meaning I wanted to take out the politics, take out any sort of confusion, and really just make it a fair, neutrally administered process that hopefully people didn't even have to think about. I viewed news as an enemy and something that I wholeheartedly wanted to avoid. I have failed miserably, but I would argue that it hasn't been entirely my fault. And so, over the past 7 months, 8 months since taking office, it's been very interesting, and there have been a lot of challenges to the manner in which elections are conducted in Maricopa County. So I say all of this as somebody who is a full-throated Republican, somebody who's a full-throated conservative, somebody who has a lot of libertarian tendencies. I participated in the Intercollegiate Studies Institute as a college student. I worked at the Cato Institute. I worked at American Enterprise Institute. I like the Koch brothers. I don't dislike them. I think they're a good thing. I'm a member of the Federalist Society. And so really it's been almost amusing and alarming to have been denounced by many in my party because I have been adamantly opposed to efforts to undermine the confidence in our elections. I have been adamantly opposed to the ongoing Arizona audit that is being conducted by Senate leadership. And I have been opposed to the disinformation that continues to be put out by members of the former president's office, by the former president himself, regarding the administration of 2020 elections. In Maricopa County, our election was administered fairly, it was administered competently, and it was administered lawfully. And I have no skin in the game. I'm saying those things because they are true, not because I ran the election. I didn't run the election. My political opponent actually ran the election. I'm saying those simply because they are true. Now, before every election and after every election, the county has to perform a number of mandatory tests. Those tests include putting a stack of ballots into the tabulation machine that are pre-marked and then making sure that the ballots are read correctly. That's called the logic and accuracy test. Those came back 100%. It includes a post-election hand count audit, and this past November, Maricopa County hand count audited with the involvement of the political parties, both Republican and Democrat, approximately 47,000 votes, and those matched 100% with what the machines had matched. And then they did a post-election audit too. And then the Board of Supervisors and I, my partner on the county level, said, you know what? We understand that there's still a deficit of confidence. We're going to do further tests on this tabulation equipment. And so we brought in two certified professional companies to do thorough evaluations of the tabulation equipment. This is the Dominion voting systems, to make sure they weren't hacked, to make sure no malware was installed, to make sure that they weren't physically manipulated, and to make sure that they didn't connect to the internet. And all of that came back clean. Now, the Arizona Senate decided that it still wanted to do its own audit, its own test. And to begin with, I thought, okay, well, I guess that can't hurt. One more test. And I think many Republicans in particular shared that sentiment. And maybe many Americans said, well, what's the harm in one more test? Well, little did we know that the Senate would enlist a company called Cyber Ninjas, which was a company from Sarasota, Florida, of either one or two people that had never done anything related to elections. And this threw all of our assumptions about this process for a loop. So I likened it to tax audits. And a lot of people say, well, if you have nothing to hide, it shouldn't be a problem that the IRS wants to audit you. And so I would say to them, well, what if the IRS outsourced the audit to an auditor who had no professional credentials, had never previously run a tax audit, believed that Hugo Chavez had somehow manipulated your tax auditing software, your tax software, and had publicly stated prior to examining your taxes that you had committed fraud and that you should be arrested. And yet that's the situation we're dealing with here with the cyber ninjas who are performing the Arizona Senate's audit. They are led by conspiracy theorists who have indulged in the wildest conspiracy theories about our 2020 election. They are led by people who had never touched an election audit prior to 2021. They are led by people who have stated explicitly that President Trump had the election stolen from him. They are funded by entirely Stop the Steal advocates and Trump supporters. And so you then, taking into account those types of input variables, it's no surprise that the output has produced what it has produced, which is a series of wild accusations and ongoing misinformation. And the point at which I got involved is when they started accusing me and my staff of unlawful doing. First, they accused us of unlawfully deleting files. Well, after they let that out for about a week, they said, oops, we actually have the files. Then they said, well, there's the ballots, the actual number of ballots doesn't match what you purport it was in the 2020 election. But they've since walked back that claim. Then they said, oh, you had 47,000 fraudulent ballots inserted into your system. But it turns out that that's not the case either, and that they've walked that back. But the amount of damage that they are doing to us as individuals, to the hardworking people of Maricopa County, can't be measured. And the amount of damage that they are doing to our system and to our democracy and to our election process by airing these unfounded accusations, airing these unfounded conspiracies, and then having to sort of quietly walk them back after they've already been voiced by people as prominent as President Trump, is just irresponsible and is damaging to the system. So I have consistently stated that though I'm a proud conservative, I'm a proud Republican, I voted for President Trump in this last election, this audit is irresponsible and incredibly damaging to our system. I would strongly encourage other jurisdictions to not do such a type of audit. And I guess I'll stick around for any questions. That was about the time you wanted, hopefully.
Yes, thank you very much, Stephen. We will have some Q&As and some specifically for you. So if you'll stick around to the end, I know we have some questions for you. Thank you. So next we'll hear from Roy Herrera, a political law attorney. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm getting over a cold, thankfully not COVID, so my voice is a little bit hoarse today, so I apologize for that. But first, just like the county recorder did, I want to thank all of the co-hosts for this event and for the invitation, and of course the other distinguished panelists that are on to talk to you today. I love, obviously, election law. It's been what I have practiced for almost the last 10 years of my career. I run the political law shop at a law firm called Ballard Spahr. Prior to that, I was at the Department of Justice. And prior to that, I was on Capitol Hill as a staffer. I am a Democrat since our county recorder, who's a dear friend of mine, outed himself. I out myself as a Democrat. I represent Democratic candidates and Democratic groups. That being said, I have a great deal of pride in saying that I have many friends on the Republican side, and I think our county recorder would attest to that. And that's primarily driven by, I think, a shared belief in our democracy and an admiration for our democracy, and in particular in Arizona, an admiration for our election procedures, because I do think that we run despite some of the controversies with this audit, some of the best elections in the country. And so as a result, it has been disturbing to me, this is my editorial piece here, what we've been seeing in this audit, because I think the problem with it has been that it's called into question confidence in that system. But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here to talk about the Brenovich case, the Brenovich v. DNC case, which is a recent Supreme Court decision related to voting rights. I'm going to try to make this as easily understood as possible, because this, sometimes can get a little bit, and I can sometimes get a little bit into the weeds on these various tests under the Voting Rights Act. But I'll try to make it as easy as possible to understand. This was a significant case, and I think it's really significant for two reasons. The first, primarily, is because this is the first Voting Rights Act case that we have seen before this new Supreme Court. We had 3 Trump-appointed justices to the Supreme Court. I think all objective observers would say that the court is more conservative now, and this is the first time we would see a Section 2 case under the VRA decided by the court. And so I think everyone was watching very closely to see, what the viewpoint of the court would be under this, under the Section 2 of the VRA. And then the second reason I think it was an important case and one that people were following is precisely because it was a Section 2 case. It's very rare that a Section 2 type case gets before the United States Supreme Court. And I have a theory on that, which is primarily, and to back up a little bit, what Section 2 of the VRA allows is for litigants to challenge the legality of a voting procedure on the basis that it discriminates on race or on the basis of race. So it was the first time we had this kind of case before the Supreme Court, and this was primarily styled as what election law attorneys would call a vote denial case. And the reason all that is important is because we hadn't, up until this point, had a clear test, legal test, as to how a plaintiff could establish a vote denial claim under Section 2. We have a test for vote dilution cases. That's the so-called Jingles test under Section 2. But those types of claims come under a redistricting context. And I actually happen to be the Independent Redistricting Commission's counsel right now. And so I'm primarily worried about vote dilution claims. But in this case, this was a vote denial claim. We didn't have a test. And so I think the election law world was waiting to see whether this case would establish one for vote denial claims. Now, before I get into the holding of the case, let's talk about what it was specifically about. The Brenovich case dealt with 2 different voting policies or procedures. The first, and they both happen to be in Arizona, so this is very apropos for this town hall. The first is Arizona's policy that required the rejection of election day ballots that were cast out of precinct. So to the extent that a county had a precinct type model as far as where people could vote, there is an Arizona rule that requires the rejection of ballots that were cast out of precincts. So if you go to the wrong precinct, those election day ballots wouldn't count. The second procedure is the so-called ballot collection rule, which essentially prohibited you from collecting ballots for as a third party, for other individuals. This was a rule that was passed by the state legislature back in 2016 and immediately was sued upon by the DNC. So what was at issue here was, again, these 2 particular voting procedures. The court ultimately sided with Attorney General Brnovich in a 6-3 vote. Justice Alito authored the opinion and found that there was no violation of Section 2 related to these 2 particular policies. Now, again, bringing back to how I started, one of the important parts of this case was that it was a vote denial type claim, and we were all sort of anxiously awaiting to see whether the court would adopt a test. Now, the court, I think, went into some length to say that it was not adopting a test, that basically the factors it considered when it reached its conclusion were not exhaustive, and that perhaps there would be other factors the court would consider in the future. And in addition, the court made kind of an interesting distinction to say, well, this is not a vote dilution case. This is what we call a time, place, or manner case. In other words, the policies that are at issue here deal with time, place, or manner restrictions on voting. And then the court went on to say, well, here are the factors that we're considering here, in order to decide whether Section 2 has been violated. The court ended up coming up with 5 factors, which, for the sake of just simplicity, let's just call them the Brenovich factors. I don't know if they'll actually be called that, but for purposes of this, they came up with 5 different factors and then went through the analysis under those 5 factors to find that there was no violation of Section 2. So what are those factors that the court looked at, again, in a time, place, or manner type test or type situation? The first is the court looked to the size of the burden imposed by the challenged voting rule. And there was a quote in the opinion that I think is going to be used in a lot of future litigation, where the court noted that, quote, mere inconvenience to the voter cannot be enough to demonstrate a violation of Section 2. So again, this first factor looks at, well, what is the size of the burden imposed by the particular challenged rule? The second factor was this sort of what I would call the 1982 factor. Basically, the court looked to whether, or to the degree to which a voting rule departed from what constituted widespread practice in 1982. 1982, the importance of that was when the VRA was amended, and Section 2 was amended. And so therefore the court said, well, let's look back at 1982 and let's see how far a challenge rule departs from what was a widespread practice back then. The third factor looked to the size of the disparity in the rule's impact on members of different racial groups. So basically, what is the disparate impact on racial minorities by that, or posed by that particular voting restriction? And then the fourth factor is, well, what are the voting opportunities provided by the state's entire voting system? So the court looked to the entire state's election procedures and said, well, are there other opportunities for voting? And we should consider that when thinking about a particular restriction. And the fifth and final factor is they look to the strength of the state's interests that were served by the challenged voting rule. And in particular, and what is notable here is the court focused or mentioned that the avoidance of voter fraud could be a main state interest at play under this factor. So those are the 5 factors, and I'll get to the application of them specifically in one sec here on the 2 procedures. But the question, I think, for practitioners going forward is, in future vote denial cases, or time, place, and manner cases, as the court described them, are these the factors that essentially we have to look to in order to establish whether Section 2 has been violated? And so I think the answer to that is likely yes. And certainly the lower courts, I think, are going to interpret it that way. But that is essentially the new sort of Brenovich test going forward. I also should have started, by the way, with a caveat, which is, or I should say a disclaimer. I filed an amicus brief in this case on behalf of several groups, including the League of Women Voters, asking for a different test. Now, of course, they didn't listen to me at all, so I guess my amicus didn't go very far, but I just want to mention that so everyone's clear. But looking at the 5 factors as it was applied to the 2 rules in question in Arizona, first of all, on the out-of-precinct policy, the court found that that policy posed only a modest burden on voters, and that the racial disparity of the impact of that particular policy was small. Furthermore, the court noted that precinct-based voting, which again is implicated by that precinct policy that I mentioned at the beginning, serves a legitimate state interest in keeping waiting times low and ensuring orderly administration. So again, looking at the 5th factor that I mentioned, the state interest, the court found that precinct-based voting served that state interest. What I think was even more controversial, or at least more, the media at least focused more on, was the ballot collection rule. And as for that rule, the court found that personally returning or dropping off an early ballot is part of the normal burdens associated with voting, and that potential burdens on voters who have to travel great distances are mitigated by the long early voting period that Arizona has. So it was alleged, for example, that particularly on the Navajo reservation, it'd be very difficult for voters to drop off their ballots. Well, the court pointed to the long early voting period as a way to mitigate that. Next, and I'll quickly wrap up here because I know I'm at time. The court found that the challengers offered no statistical evidence of disparate impact in this case, and instead relied only on testimony. I think that's an important thing to note, because in cases going forward, when people ask, well, is Section 2 obliterated? One can take that position, and certainly I have major concerns. But certainly I think the future is trying to develop that statistical evidence that the court found lacking in this particular case. And then the last thing I'll mention is that the court noted that the state's interest in preventing fraud would have been great enough to overcome even a showing of disparate impact, as mail-in voting, according to this court, is more susceptible to fraud and intimidation than in-person voting. So this was the application of the case. I'll wrap up and of course can answer Q&A questions, but it's a notable case because it may have established a new set of rules or a new rule going forward for vote denial claims under Section 2. and then of course indicates, I think, what the court is or how the court is looking at BRA claims going forward. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Next, we'll be hearing from Jessica Marsden of Protect Democracy.
Thanks, Andrea, and it's a pleasure to be here with this wonderful panel. I'm a counsel at Protect Democracy, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to preventing American democracy from declining into a more authoritarian form of government. And I've been asked to sort of situate what's happening in Arizona within the broader context of national trends around voting in elections. 2021 has been an enormously busy year for voting rights legislation at the state level, and that largely has its roots in last year's election. So 2020 was truly unprecedented, give the effort to conduct a sort of major national election during a major global pandemic, and it involved many states experimenting with new ways to make it easier for people to vote and to vote safely. And it ended up being, not just in Arizona, but across the country, quite successful in terms of voter turnout and the relative smoothness of the process. Although the post-election period, particularly with respect to the presidential race, was obviously fraught. So when you look at the legislation that has been introduced across the country this year, much of it seems to be a reflection of how different legislators feel about 2020 and the results of that election. So on the pro-voter side, according to the most recent Brennan Center for Justice data, legislators in 25 states have enacted 54 laws that do things that expand voter access, that make it easier to vote, in many cases by replicating what made 2020 so successful. For example, expanding early voting opportunities, making it easier to vote by mail, adding drop boxes so you can just easily deliver your mail ballots the same way you would return a library book, and easing voter registration. But on the anti-voter side, legislators in at least 18 states enacted at least 30 laws that restrict access to the vote. So, and many of these laws take aim at the same tools that helped facilitate turnout and a smooth running election in 2020. So instead of making it easier to apply for a mail ballot, they make it harder. They make it harder to distribute mail ballot applications and harder for voters to return those ballots. Arizona, unfortunately, has enacted at least 3 measures that we would classify in this anti-voter category, including making it harder to remain on absentee voting lists, imposing stricter signature requirements if you're applying for a mail ballot, and changing the rules for voter purges. So you can see the state is sort of right in the thick of this national trend. The bills that I've described so far have focused on voter access, how hard or how easy it is for an individual to vote. But I want to spend a few more minutes discussing another trend that we're seeing when we look at legislative activity across the country. And that's a pattern of legislators introducing bills that would meddle with the basic rules of election administration, not voters' experience of how hard or easy it is to cast a ballot, but kind of the nuts and bolts of behind the scenes, how elections are run. And my organization put out a report with partners, a couple of reports in this spring that identified at least 200 bills introduced in 41 states across the country that in various ways shift responsibility for election administration in ways that may create more opportunities for partisan interference in election results. Here too, I think the story starts with 2020, when in the post-election period, we saw sort of hyper-partisans in some state legislators seeking to overturn the presidential election results in their particular state. Those efforts were not successful, but some of those same legislators are now introducing bills that would give state legislatures the power to step in and overturn election results or make changes to the ways elections are run in ways that create the opportunity for partisan interference. The most extreme bills, including one that was introduced in Arizona, were not passed into law, so that's good. But we have seen a number of bills passed that allow legislators to meddle in other ways with how elections are run, and that more generally will create uncertainty and doubt about election results. And that uncertainty and doubt can be exploited for political purposes, along the lines of what I think we're seeing now with the audit that we're seeing going on in Arizona. So to highlight a couple of the laws that have passed, we've seen in Georgia, for instance, the state legislature take more control over who is running elections at the local level. We've seen in a number of other states, including Iowa, laws that make it a lot less desirable to be an election administrator, for example, by increasing penalties for minor technical mistakes. And between these laws and the sort of enormous number of threats that we've seen directed at election workers, there appears to be a trend of many longtime election workers leaving their jobs, raising real questions of how we're going to run a smooth election in future years without these experienced election workers. In Kansas, for example, the legislature is now has passed a bill that means they'll have to consent to settle any election law litigation, which increases the likelihood that election procedures will be tied up in court, again, sort of creating more uncertainty about the political process. I really appreciated what prior speakers have said about the importance of running elections as a level playing field for all candidates and voters. As a nonpartisan organization, we think that is really critical to what it means to be a democracy. Everyone has to be able to sort of join the fray, and then the winner of the election has to be respected, and power has to actually change hands in accordance with the way voters cast their ballot. Some of the laws that we're seeing this year, I think, call that principle into jeopardy. And so as we look ahead to 2022 and 2024 and the legislative sessions that will take place between now and then, we're going to continue to be particularly looking for more efforts to kind of meddle in the basics of election administration, not just these voter access issues that have gotten a lot of headlines. So thanks a lot for having me again.
Thank you for being here with us. We have our last speaker, Danielle Corbett, is a member of Mormon Women for Ethical Government.
Hi, my name is Danielle. Thank you so much for having me speak today. I am the Engaged Specialist for MWAG here in Arizona. I wear a few hats, but today I will be speaking on a human touch to voting issues here. I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. So have some patience with me while I do that. So I'm going to go ahead and do a presentation, and it's about an op-ed that was published in Arizona Daily Star on July 13th of this year. It's entitled, "What Message is Arizona Sending to Its Voters?" The op-ed basically chronicles my dad, who originally came from North Carolina, and he moved to Arizona in his early 70s. He was in the military, so he was stationed here. Despite being a super humble individual, my father was, he did not speak much about himself, but he had a lot to share with the world. For example, in his retirement years, he eventually moved and settled in California, and he volunteered for many things, one of which would be a poll worker. He really believed in voting and also protecting other people's ability to vote. In my op-ed, I discuss a tragedy. My dad was diagnosed with cancer in May of 2020, and unfortunately, he succumbed to COVID-19 in January of this year. And this happened when he was temporarily living in an assisted living facility. So we had hopes he would return just after his surgery, but unfortunately. Ultimately, this op-ed is an account of my dad's opportunity to vote in the very last election of his life. And it begs the question, would he have been able to exercise his right to vote as easily in Arizona as he could have in California? And I even asked myself, would my father even recognize the spirit of Arizona? But considering this is the state he came to know and love and admire, but with its recent voting policies, I don't think he, would recognize it in the same way. or me even admire in the same way. So the next few slides are about my father and how the 1960s influenced him, but also gave him a perspective about how life impacts policies. And this is the backstory of my op-ed. In 1964, students from North Carolina A&T University did the unthinkable. They actually decided to go to a Woolworth counter during a time of segregation where Blacks were not served at the same time as whites at the counter. In this picture, you see the 4 individuals. It's a statue that's on the North Carolina A&T University campus, and they are known as the Greensboro Four. In 1962, my dad started North Carolina A&T University. It's a historically Black university. And if you want more details about the history, you can look it up, and it's really fascinating about how it became to be. But he was the 1966, yes, graduating class. And he was a dynamic student involved in a lot of different things. You can see here, he was the student body treasurer in 1965. But in 1962, life changed for my dad as he started his freshman year. He would have come in contact with the individual you see off to the right. And this individual was Jesse Jackson. In 1963, actually going back in 1961, Jesse Jackson heard about what students of North Carolina A&T did with at the Woolworth counter, and it had a profound effect upon him. It made a deep impression. And so he transferred to North Carolina A&T University just because of that from another institution. And then in 1963, he became the student body president, and he led a lot of different civil rights demonstrations throughout Greensboro. And in 1963 was the year of his arrest, along with other students who were part of these demonstrations, which included my father. When we look back at everything, North Carolina A&T University and its students were a very important catalyst for the 1960s civil rights movement and serve as a perfect example of how their personal struggles, quality, influence what ultimately became the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So let's take a moment and focus on voting rights happening here in Arizona. Arizona, I'll throw a few facts at you. For one, Arizona has been a state where early voting has been a privilege to its people for a long time. In 2007, Arizona's permanent early voting list was established. And then in this article I got from the Associated Press, the title, it says, "Some Republicans worry voting limits will hurt the GOP too." And I feel as though this is especially true in Arizona, mostly because of this fact that approximately 80% of Arizonans vote by mail. That's 80%. And when you measure that up conversely to the national average, it's only 20%. So voting by mail is very important here in Arizona. As our other panelists spoke about, recent voting rules in Arizona, such as State Senate Bill 1485 and House Bill 2023, basically cripples early voting, and in some really obvious ways. For example, elderly voters, they have a hard time, especially if they're living alone, away from the rest of their family members. They are dependent on other people to collect their ballots, either dropping it off at an early voting site or a polling place, or even dropping it off at rural voters also get a brunt of this impact. Farmers and people who live in indigenous communities in Arizona, they have to travel a long distance in order to reach polling center or even the post office. Especially true with Indigenous voters, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. But an example of a rural community, which is Yuma, there's an area of the metropolitan there, but 91% of its voters, not all of its population, but its voters, utilized early voting during the 2020 election. We also have inconsistent voters. They will be affected by the purging of the permanent early voting list, and different ways. If they are not actively voting and they're not aware of these new rules, they will be confused when it comes time for them to vote. We also have young voters, college students, who either move away from home or may stay in town but keep moving from a dorm to an apartment to a condominium. The possibility of them voting, casting their ballot in the wrong precinct is kind of high for them too. Those with multiple jobs, those who depend on an early voting ballot in order to get their voice heard, will be impacted as well, because it's really hard to take off time to go to a polling place. So they are very dependent on the easiness, the fluidity of the early voting process here in Arizona. And lastly, but not least, those like my dad who came down with a sudden illness, cancer, or those who suffer from chronically debilitating illnesses like depression or anxiety or arthritis, those who cannot predict what their day-to-day health will be like, will also be impacted by some of the restrictive voting measures out there. And I said I was going to talk a little bit about the Indigenous population. And I'm not going to cover all of the possibilities that they face, but Indigenous voters, especially in the Navajo Nation, they're in different states. They cover a large area. And sometimes it takes them more than 70 miles just to get to a polling place. And this is really impacted because a lot of times the polling places are not on their tribal land, so they have to leave their tribal lands. There's also issues with voting ID or the tribal ID not being totally adequate enough in fulfilling what is needed to vote, the local voting requirements. So there are a lot of other issues going on there. And like the other earlier panelists said, there's other issues to look at that comes down to the terms of numbers, and not just stories, but stories are really important too. So the main goal or the take-home message is that these voting measures that are being passed recently are really restrictive to all voters, really, if you look at it. And so I hope as Arizona moves forward, they would want to consider revisiting some of its own voting right history, where they repeat or redesign some of the transgressions from the past. So whether it was my dad, I feel as though speaking through Beyond the Veil in my op-ed, or if it's Jesse Jackson coming to Arizona, which I didn't know, at the end of July, reminding us of today's voting rights struggle issues. I do not believe it's just a coincidence that these two men from North Carolina A&T University had their moment in time to be heard throughout all of Arizona in the month of July about voting rights. When I look at these two pictures of my dad and Jesse Jackson, I'm impressed what they've done. They've done things totally different in life, but I'm really impressed what they've done personally through whatever challenges and blockages that they had to endure, and also professionally, especially during the time that they came from. And this sentiment that I have about these two men and what they did and fought for others, and in terms of civil rights and voting rights, fits in perfectly from a quote from a U.S. attorney, Felix S. Cohen. And I'm just going to go ahead and, hopefully passionately read this quote just to make a point. In a democracy, suffrage is the most basic civil right, since its exercise is the chief means whereby other rights may be safeguarded. To deny the right to vote where one is legally entitled to do so is to do violence to the principle of freedom and equality. So thank you so much for letting me.
Thank you so much, Danielle. So we have a little bit of a conclusion, and then we'll have our Q&A.
You're muted, Shiloh.
There we go. Pardon me. Thank you, Andrea. I really enjoyed this meeting. There are a variety of perspectives put forward, and I think we all came out with a better understanding of the issues and challenges ahead. Voting rights is supported by many communities, and it shouldn't be a partisan issue. And for all of us, it isn't a partisan issue. It's crucial for a stable economy and a stable society to have an active representative democracy where every citizen has a voice. And your engagement matters. You as an individual, your company, or local faith-based group are important to engage with political leaders on the issue, on this and other issues. We were so pleased at Leadership Now to partner with MWEG to bring a business perspective to these issues today. We're a coalition of business leaders who are dedicated to democracy, evidence-based policy, and building a fairer economy. We're active across the country and would love to keep you up to date and help get you involved in our activities. So please go to our website and sign up for our newsletter as well. All the relevant links should be included in the chat. Thank you all again for joining us, and thank you to our panelists for sharing their work. We look forward to hearing from you all again soon.
Thank you. We do have a few questions that people have submitted before our meeting and during our meeting. And we do have a few of them that have suggested people to answer. And otherwise, if panelists have thoughts on the question, they can jump in. So our first question is, the January 6th attack on the Capitol drove home for me that the American dream is fragile and under attack. This person, by the way, is a young adult in Phoenix just beginning their career in adult life. And that protectors of the American democracy look not just like boots on the ground abroad, but citizens fighting for freedom at home. I want to take an active role in protecting democracy and the right to vote in my community, but I'm not sure where to start. My question is, where do I start, and what can I do to help protect democracy and fight for the right to vote in my community? And maybe Jessica Marsden, would you like to address that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So I think a couple of ideas. First, no matter where you live, you are not alone, I think, in wanting to take action now to help protect our democracy. And across the country, I think we've seen sort of local organizations spring up to get involved on these democracy issues. So the first thing I do is look for a group of people near you who are already working on these issues, whose efforts you can join. Maybe that's Mormon Women for Ethical Government. Maybe it's another group. It doesn't have to be a political group or a partisan group at all. There are a lot of sort of nonpartisan groups that are focused on these issues. And the second suggestion I have is think about getting involved in helping to run your local elections by volunteering as a poll worker. We saw last year that was an area of great need and an opportunity where all of us can really make a concrete contribution to sort of making the wheels of our democracy run smoothly.
Thank you so much. Our next question was actually asked in the Q&A box, and Stephen Richer answered it, but maybe we can repeat it for the benefit of everybody. From Rachel Clausen: as a voter, I am so upset by how my ballot has been put in the hands of people who should never have had any responsibility with my secret and sacred vote. Who has the authority to prevent our ballot from getting in the hands of other unqualified groups or individuals in the future? Stephen?
Yeah, I wasn't sure if those messages were directly to me, so I just started answering to some of them, and apologies if I wasn't supposed to. Going back to the previous question, January 6th was an abomination, and it should only be characterized as such. And the Capitol Police Force and other people who stood to defend the members of Congress at great personal risk, and some of whom died in that incident, should be treated as heroes. And so I think any characterization of that day in other terms is really inappropriate. Regarding your ballot, so your ballot is secret. Your ballot, well, always has been secret, and your ballot still is secret. Once you separate the envelope here in Maricopa County, once you separate the early voting envelope from the actual ballot itself, there's no way of linking who you voted for back to your name or to your signature. Unless you wrote on the actual ballot, you're like, hi, my name is Rachel Clausen, then that wouldn't be linked back. The Superior Court found in late February that the Arizona Senate's subpoena power did extend to allow them to subpoena these materials, namely all the tabulation equipment and the 2.1 million ballots cast in Maricopa County. And so they did have the lawful authority to conduct this review. Now, of course, that doesn't mean you have to like the manner in which the review is being conducted. And I would encourage you to write to your senators if you have thoughts on it, one way or another.
Thank you. This question is for Roy Herrera. Since the Brnovich decision really limits the impact of Section 2 on the Voting Rights Act, is there any chance going forward that different court rulings could affect this? Or is the best chance for successfully bringing cases against voting discrimination through new federal legislation?
Well, I mean, I would start by saying the latter would be preferable. I mean, if we could get national, voting rights legislation passed, if you've seen in the news, I'm sure you've seen, a lot of coverage of HR 1 and, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and some of those things, which I do think would help greatly in protecting the right to vote. I think the Brenovich decision, I'm a lawyer, so I have to take kind of a more distant view of it, in the sense that, we don't know how lower courts are going to interpret it yet. We will, because additional voting restrictions are getting passed by state legislatures across the country, as Jessica mentioned. In Arizona in particular, we've seen a great deal of activity, and I wouldn't be surprised if next January, when we have the second session of the legislature, we see additional changes to voting procedure, and those will all be challenged again under Section 2 or the 14th Amendment or something like that, a constitutional claim, and we'll see how the courts interpreted the fallout of Brenovich. But I do think a national standard would be very helpful. But I do want to go back to a point that was made a little bit ago, which is talking about election subversion. I don't know if it's a controversial view or a non-controversial view, but it's my view, which is that we talk about a lot of these restrictions that I think are harmful that are getting passed out of the legislature, which really have a lot of ways have to do with affecting the way people vote. They're all bad in my view. And I think it's sort of death by a thousand cuts, right? If we keep passing a bunch of these things, our democracy is at risk. But my controversial view is that the more immediate concern is election subversion. It's this idea that we cannot all agree that the winner of an election is the winner, and then move on and have debates, real public policy debates on other issues. I mean, I say this all the time with in media appearances that I have. It's like, I would love to be debating immigration policy, even as a Democrat. That might not be good for me in Arizona, but immigration policy, economic policy, regular things, the size of government, instead of talking about whether there's voter fraud, because there isn't. And so I think if we get to a point where we can try to address the subversion piece. Just yesterday, Amy Klobuchar, the senator from Minnesota, introduced a bill that directly gets it at that, right? Is trying to update the Electoral Count Act. I mean, I was Biden's state counsel, so I was involved in all the post-election litigation. And it really shouldn't come down to all of that. We shouldn't be in danger of not having an actual result, that everyone believes in. And so I think that's also an important thing where we may need national legislation, or at the very least, support locally for your elected officials, like my friend Stephen, because they need that support, right? I mean, they're the ones that are upholding our democracy. And I think that's really what's at risk.
Can I agree and then disagree, or not agree and then amend a little tiny bit? So may I?
Do all those things.
Oh no, I wasn't sure. I wasn't asking for your permission, Roy. I was asking for Andrea's.
You never do. You never do.
You were welcome to add to the discussion.
Okay, 1,000% agree with the notion that what is happening right now at the Coliseum with trying to challenge who won the last presidential election is way more potentially harmful to our voting rights than is what's happening at the state capitol. That if we cannot as a country accept who won, even though there were no major flaws or major problems in the process, then that's a deal breaker. But then I'll amend some of the stuff about some of the legislation. First, the Brnovich versus DNC case enshrines what we had in Arizona, and 80% of registered voters voted in this last election, and that's an amazing turnout. May it always be so high. And I just would just say, regardless of what you think of recent legislation passed this last cycle, Arizona is comparatively a very easy state to vote in. Many states don't allow you to vote by mail without a reason. Many states don't allow you to vote in person. In Arizona, you can vote in person up to 27 days before an election, and you can vote by mail. And also in Arizona, now in Maricopa County, it doesn't matter if you go to your right precinct. You can show up to any polling place in Maricopa County because we now have these voting centers. And so, if you have a problem with getting to the polls in Maricopa County, email me and I will personally make sure that you have access to vote. But I think we're actually doing things pretty well in Arizona, and I hope we continue that trend, and I hope we celebrate that we're doing some things really well, and we don't look to pull back on those.
Thank you. And actually, our next question is for you too, Stephen. After the cyber ninja situation, what is the best way going forward that the public can know that election audits are trustworthy and reputable? What are the standards or signs to watch out for?
Well, I mean, one, election audits moving forward. I don't know what it will look like. Will we do this after every, federal election cycle? That's a scary thought. But this is really uncharted territory. This has never happened before. There are the statutory pre and post election audits that are done by the county, but nothing like weighing the paper, testing for UV lights to test for bamboo fibers or anything like that has ever happened before. I would say when you're assessing an audit company, assess them as you using the same metrics that you would any other company, like just a better business bureau type thing. Do they have experience? Are they using scientifically proven methodology? Do they have a good reputation within the field? Have they been fair brokers in their public comments? And I think my objection to this audit isn't that it's an audit. It's just that the answer to all of those in the context of the cyber ninjas is no, 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 no. And we've seen how that's borne out, and it's been terrible.
Thank you. Okay, and this is a question. We just have a couple more minutes. This question is open to anyone who would like to answer. What should I be doing between elections to help get the most out of voting rights?
I mean, I know that Jessica had to jump off, but I would echo something that she said, which is, participating in elections directly. I mean, I totally agree with Stephen on this, the quality of our elections in Arizona. I think I said that in my presentation. I mean, I think the way we do elections in Arizona is much better than any other place, any other state. But I think that's primarily because we have so many great volunteers that come out as poll workers, people that come out to participate in election protection efforts. So I know she said in between, but certainly in the run-up and during the election, participating in the election itself is super important. But in between, I think it comes down to getting involved in your community organizations, whether they're partisan or nonpartisan, that are all focused on these issues. because it is a major issue. It's kind of an unprecedented situation with the audit, but then also the amount of volume of voting changes and proposals that are going at the Capitol, the nation's capital, and then here in Arizona. And so paying attention, getting involved, all of those things are really important because it's one of the top issues I think that everyone is focused on.
Let Danielle's father be your inspiration too. Write an editorial. If you want to be a poll worker, we're always looking for poll workers, especially around major election season. So that will be coming up again in June, July of 2022. We would welcome your involvement.
Thank you.
I would like to say, just follow whatever's going on in the state legislature. There's a lot of bills that are, getting through. Sometimes they're getting through because no one's watching them. And so we have a wonderful system here where you can kind of weigh in your opinion and try to help prevent some of these measures from even getting as far as they do. And so just learning more about that, it would benefit a lot.
Thank you. Let's see, I think that we are just about out of time. We've reached our end of our time together. We're so grateful again for all of our panelists that have taken time out of their busy schedules to join us today. And we're grateful for all of the people that have taken time to learn with us during this town hall. And we hope that everyone has, Danielle, yes.
I just wanted to say that Erin T. Young, who helped put this together, she also reminded me, and I'm not sure if you mentioned it already, that today is the anniversary of the Voting Rights Act.
I think it was beautiful kismet that we plan to have this today, and we're grateful for that anniversary. Thank you, and I hope everyone has a great weekend.